I was quite unhappy with the compromises that were made on the Ryzen 5 4600G's CPU. But with a good enough IGPU, the shortcomings of the CPU could be somewhat justified. Now, the Radeon Vega 7 IGPU that comes with the 4600G is the same as the one shipped with the Ryzen 5 5600G, and this will help us gauge its price. And by the way, you can pause the video here to have a look at all its details, as many as the rather poor driver is willing to disclose. But back to pricing, the delta between the MSRPs of the 5600G and the plain 5600 is 60 USD. That's quite steep for an iGPU, and there are plenty of used discrete graphics cards that are even cheaper than that. APUs do not require a power supply with PCI power cables, so I'll have to disqualify any GPUs that cannot rely on the PCI slot alone. And between the remaining candidates, the 20 USD RX 460 and what used to be the 60 USD GTX 1050 Ti, I decided to test both. The test system is the same as in the CPU related video. The Ryzen 5 4600G for CPU and iGPU, 32GB of DDR4 running in dual channel at 3000 MHz, and both dedicated graphic cards mentioned before. And while faster DDR4 could help, one of the main problems with the iGPU is that it has to share the memory bus with the CPU. If one of them needs access to RAM, the other one is basically SOL. And it goes without saying, CPUs with smaller cache will need to access the RAM more often. Marvel Rivals is barely playable. While the average FPS of 72 is fine, one will need to turn a blind eye to the 1% lows of 56. Getting that blind eye is going to be scarcely easy due to the graphical settings needed to get that performance, 720 resolution, low settings and performance upscaling. Yeah, glasses won't help here. But at full 1280 by 720, the Vega 7 averages only 37 FPS, 11 less than the RX 460, and gets only 32 41% lows for a similar delta than the same metric scored by the RX 460. As for the GTX 1050 Ti, this is a no contest. 69 FPS for the average and low 50s 41% lows makes this game actually playable. Lower settings at full 720 resolution is not going to cut it for Cyberpunk 2077. While the Vega 7 iGPU averages 35 FPS, the 1% loss of 23 FPS cannot be ignored. Some can grind through it, but others might want to try using FSR at the quality settings. You do lose some of the already little visual quality that was left, but hey, you get 44 FPS for the average and more importantly 32 41% lows. But without FSR, the iGPU gets 35 FPS and 23 for the average and the 1% lows respectively. This is 7 less FPS on average than the RX 460. As for the GTX 1050 Ti, Vega 7's average barely goes above the 1% lows scored by the Nvidia card. The finals is not really playable. While the bar I set for multiplayer titles is 60 plus FPS for the 1% lows, 50 plus is tolerable. But the Vega 7 gets only 42 FPS for the 1% lows and 56 for the average, at only 720 resolution and low settings. The RX 460, as expected, performs significantly better, with 66 FPS on average and 52 for the 1% lows, while the GTX 1050 Ti is the uncontested leader with 91 FPS for the average and 58 FPS for the 1% lows. The Cyberpunk 2077 situation repeats itself in Robocop City of Heroes, but somehow amplified. 720 resolution at low settings is brutal on the Vega 7, and the poor chip barely manages 23 FPS for the average and 20 for the 1% lows. Lowering the rendering scale will increase the FPS, and at 70 or so percent for the rendering scale, the chip gets the 1% lows above 30, with the expected drops in visuals of course. The lack of VRAM really affects the RX 460, which barely makes it out of the teens with the average FPS. Not the case with the 1050 Ti, which manages a small performance advantage. In Fortnite, using the new DirectX 12 based performance mode, the iGPU manages 1% lows above 60 FPS at all tested resolutions. Averages range between 84 FPS at 1080 and 117 FPS at 720. The 1% lows span between 60 FPS at 1080 and 80 FPS at 720. This makes the game experience quite good. The GTX 1050 Ti performs better on average by a factor of almost 2 at 1080 resolution and the same performance mode. The RX 460 leads the iGPU by just 25% at 1080, and while this seems small, this then increases to 50% as the resolution drops. Terminator resistance is easier to run, so the Vega 7 gets the 1% lows above 30 at 1080 low settings and at 1600 by 900 medium settings. I can also play at 1080 medium since 29 FPS 41% lows is not that bad. And with the average FPS ranging between high 30s and low 50s, the game is quite playable. And just like a broken record, I have to mention that the IGPU gets owned at 1080 low settings by both the RX 460 and the GTX 1050 Ti, on average by around 50% and 100% respectively. In Counter-Strike 2, the Vega 7 IGPU gets the 1% lows above 60 FPS at all tested resolutions, as long as we're using low settings. The typical bot match I use had the IGPU averaging between 77 FPS at 1080 and 115 FPS at 720. The 1% lows range between 61 FPS at 1080 resolution and 82 FPS at 720. And while the game is playable on the integrated graphics, at 1080 low settings the discrete graphics get on average double the FPS and more, in the case of the RX 460 and the GTX 1050 Ti respectively, with the 1% lows above 100 FPS. The canned benchmark in Far Cry 6 runs surprisingly well, at both 1280 by 720 and 1600 by 900 low settings. The average FPS is 48 and 36 respectively, with the 1% lows at 42 and 32 FPS respectively. Much like with Robocop, the 2GB VRAM turns out to be the weakness for the RX 460, since at 720 resolution it still averages in the teens. But the GTX 1050 Ti has 4GB, so it does not suffer the same penalty as the AMD card. Vega 7 might not be the best GPU to play Apex Legends. Despite the low settings used, the 1% lows rises above 60 FPS only at 720 resolution. 1600 by 900 is somewhat doable if you can stomach 56 FPS for the 1% lows. The average FPS starts at 62 FPS at 1080 resolution and increases up to mid-90s as the resolution drops to 720. The RX 460 runs only a bit better than the IGPU, with less than 10% more average FPS. The 1050 Ti, however, runs 50% better on average, with a similar relative increase for the 1% lows. Doom Eternal kinda scrapes by. Normally I target 30 plus FPS for the 1% lows in single player titles, but Doom Eternal benefits from making it up to 60. I can play the game at 720 resolution and low settings on the Vega 7. The average FPS at 68 is fine, and the 1% loss of 54 FPS is not game breaking, if you ask me. The RX 460 manages to dip a bit below the IGPU at 720 and low settings. Not by much though, I mean 2 FPS on average is well within error. But the 1050 Ti averages 127 FPS and gets the 1% lows well above the average FPS of the IGPU. Rainbow Six Siege is next, and the IGPU manages 60 plus FPS for the 1% lows only at 720 resolution. The average FPS ranges between 38 at full 1080 resolution and low settings and 106 at 720 and 50% render scale. At full 1080 low settings, the RX 460 averages about 50% better and gets almost double the FPS for the 1% lows. Same applies for the 1050 Ti. Being a single player title, Control enjoys a lower bar to cross, and that is 30 plus FPS for the 1% lows. At 720 resolution and low settings, the Vega 7 IGPU manages to pull it off, with the average FPS at 43 and the 1% lows at 34. The RX 460 manages somewhat better numbers, at full 1080p. At the same settings used to test the APU though, the dedicated Polaris card averaged 92 FPS and got the 1% lows at 72. Overwatch 2 manages 60 plus FPS at low settings only at resolution of 1600 by 900 and lower. The average of 72 FPS at 1080 is fine, but 52 for the 1% lows might not cut it in this title. But 1600 by 900 and 1280 by 720 has the IGPU averaging at 98 and 144 FPS respectively, with the corresponding 1% lows being 72 and 103 FPS. But the RX 460 puts these numbers to shame, providing almost double the performance at all 3 tested resolutions, with 1080 low settings being perfectly playable. While managing 32 FPS on average in Resident Evil 4, the Vega 7 gets only 20 FPS for the 1% lows. The experience is choppy, despite using 720 resolution. For the people who really want to play the game, FSR might help, but honestly I would not recommend it. The pixel count is pretty low already. And yes, the discrete Polaris card does quite a bit better in the same conditions, averaging 54 FPS and managing 28 for the 1% lows. That's something that I could play. I expected Dota 2 to run CPU bottlenecked at 120 plus FPS on average, but 89 FPS at 1080 low settings is much lower than what the CPU side can deliver. I know that there were some compromises done with the 4600G to feed the iGPU, see my previous video, but this is still too low and I suspect that the Vega 7 is bottlenecking the system. No such problems with both the RX 460 and the GTX 1050 Ti though, and both go above 100 FPS, limited mostly by the CPU. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is playable on the iGPU at 1080 resolution, very low settings. The 26 FPS 41% lows doesn't bother me that much, and the average FPS at 31 is also acceptable. Dropping the resolution to 1600 by 900 is a valid compromise to get the 1% lows to 35 FPS and the average to 40. The GTX 1050 Ti however is twice as fast at 1080 resolution. Same for the RX 460. I mean, what can I add to that? I did manage to find some settings for Borderlands 3 where the game plays okay on the Vega 7 iGPU. 1080 very low settings is not quite there despite the 37 FPS on average, and that is due to the 1% lows in the mid-20s. 1600 by 900 low is better with 40 FPS on average and 28 FPS 41% lows. 720 medium is even better in terms of FPS, but worse in terms of pixel count. But if you opted for the RX 460 instead, 1080 very low settings has both a relatively high pixel count and playable frame rates, with the average FPS in the mid-50s and the 1% lows in the mid-40s. And if you went Nvidia instead, well, you get 71 FPS on average and 57 41% lows. I paid $20 for my RX 460. That's a third of the price AMD is asking for its Vega 7 iGPU. And the used Radeon card is literally mopping the floor with the integrated graphics, as you can see from the graph on screen, depicting sums of FPS for all three performance metrics. Opting for an Nvidia card that costs the same as the Vega 7 though, gets you a much better performance. So you tell me, what's the better stopgap option until you get the iGPU dreamed of? I can see APUs useful only in situations where space is a premium. Handhelds, mini PCs, laptops, consoles. A minor parenthesis here, the SoCs used by consoles are far better than the APUs available for consumers, having dedicated memory buses for the GPU and CPU. But only AMD benefits from customers using them in full tower PCs as a stopgap solution until a good GPU becomes available. I can't see how any of you would be happy to pay more to compromise on the CPU, to then get an iGPU weaker than video cards available on the used market. Heck, you could at least sell the used GPU later on to recover some of that money. Good luck doing that with the iGPU. Anyway, before calling this one done, I do not hate APUs. Is that if you're building a gaming PC, then low power GPUs from the used market coupled with a fully fledged CPU is the better solution. Okay, now that I got this off of my chest, thanks for watching, I hope you liked.